30 Vikings faced an entire continent and lost. Not to an army, not to a navy, to a single arrow that found the one gap in iron armor that was supposed to make its wearer invincible. 500 years before Columbus, on a beach that no European map had ever recorded, a stone-tipped arrow, fired from a bow made of wood and sinew, changed the trajectory of human history. It did not start European colonization of North America. It stopped it, for half a millennium. The first European to die fighting for American soil was not a conquistador or a pilgrim. He was a Viking, named Thorvald Eriksson, the son of Eric the Red, the brother of Leif the Lucky. And his death was not random. It was the direct consequence of a decision he made hours earlier, a decision so brutal that the land itself seemed to turn against him. He murdered 8 men in their sleep. 1 escaped, and the one who escaped brought back an army. Sometimes the smallest things change history. Sometimes one person's escape matters more than an army's advance. And sometimes stone defeats steel. This is the story of how 30 men who had conquered half of Europe were broken by people they called wretches, and why the continent those wretches defended would not see another European for 500 years. What Thorvald was sailing from matters as much as what he was sailing toward. Greenland in the year 1000 was a lie wrapped in ice. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, had discovered the island and given it the most deceptive name in history: Greenland. There was nothing green about it. The Norse settlements clung to narrow strips of coast where grass grew for 3 months of the year. Beyond those strips lay glaciers that stretched to the horizon. No trees large enough to build ships, no iron for weapons or tools, barely enough pasture to keep livestock alive through winters that lasted 8 months. The Greenlanders lived on the knife edge of survival, and the blade was getting sharper every year. Every winter was a negotiation with death. Cattle died in their stalls from cold. Children grew up never having tasted fresh bread, because grain would not grow in soil that froze 8 months of the year. Ships rotted because there was no timber to repair them. Tools broke and could not be replaced because there was no iron ore to smelt. A Greenland farmer in the year 1000 owned less than a peasant in Norway and worked 10 times harder to keep it. The colony was dying slowly, one failed harvest at a time, and everyone knew it. Then came the miracle. Leif Eriksson, Eric's eldest son, sailed west around the year 1000 and found what the sagas called Vinland, a land of wild grapes and self-sowing wheat. Rivers that teemed with salmon larger than any in European waters. Forests so thick with timber you could not see 20 feet into the trees. For people who had been burning animal dung because they had no wood, Vinland was not just opportunity, it was salvation. The reports that filtered back to Greenland painted a picture so perfect it seemed like the promises priests made about heaven. Everything Greenland lacked, Vinland had in abundance. Wood for ships. Wood for houses. Wood for fuel. Game beyond counting. Fish beyond imagining. Land that did not try to kill you 6 months of every year. But Leif left something critical out of his reports. Something that would determine whether the Norse experiment in North America succeeded or ended in blood on a beach. The land was not empty. The Norse called the people they found there Skraelings. The word dripped with contempt. Wretches, primitives, creatures barely worth acknowledging. These were not the disorganized savages that Viking prejudice imagined. These were sophisticated hunters who had survived in this land for 12,000 years. Master craftsmen who could chip stone into arrow points sharp enough to pierce leather at distance. Strategic thinkers who knew every stream, every game trail, every approach where strangers might appear. They had protocols for dealing with threats that had been refined across 400 generations of living on this land. Their warriors trained from childhood with bows that could drive an arrow through a deer at 50 paces. Their knowledge of terrain gave them a mobility that seemed ghost-like to men who depended on ships and open ground. They could appear from forest that seemed empty and vanish into forest that seemed solid. They communicated across distances using signals that traveled faster than any horse, and most crucially, they possessed something Vikings had never encountered in any enemy they had ever faced: a willingness to wait, to watch, to let the invader make the first mistake, and then to respond with a precision that left no room for recovery. The Vikings had iron. The Skraelings had something better: knowledge of every inch of the ground they stood on, and patience that iron could not buy. Thorvald Eriksson was the second of Erik's sons to attempt Vinland. Where Leif had explored and returned, Thorvald intended to stay. He assembled 30 men in Greenland, not professional soldiers but farmers, fishermen, and seasonal raiders whose families needed the resources Vinland promised. They were hard men from a hard place whose families needed the resources Vinland promised. Every one of them had buried someone who died from cold or hunger or the grinding exhaustion of farming a country that did not want to be farmed. They were not sailing for glory. They were sailing because staying meant watching their families starve. They sailed in a single longship, the same vessel Leif had used, its oak planks still carrying the salt of the Atlantic crossing. They knew the route. They knew the destination. What they did not know was that the land they were sailing toward had already decided they were not welcome. The expedition spent its first winter at Leif's abandoned camp, repairing buildings, hunting, exploring the coast in the ship's boat. It was during one of these coastal explorations that Thorvald found what he had been looking for. The promontory the sagas call Crossness jutted into the sea like a finger pointing toward destiny. Natural harbors on 3 sides offered protection from storms. Fresh water flowed from inland streams. Meadows stretched behind the beach, perfect for grazing. Forests rose behind the meadows, offering timber that would have made any Greenlander weep with relief. And from the heights of the promontory, a defender could see approaching ships from miles away. Thorvald stood at the prow of his boat, salt spray in his beard, and spoke words that would seal his fate. "Here I will build my hall. Here Norse children will be born. Here our gods will have new temples." That was who Thorvald was. Not the explorer his brother had been, not the politician his father was. He was a builder, a man who looked at empty land and saw walls rising. The ability to see what was not yet there was his gift. It was also his blindness, because he could not see that the land was already occupied by people who had no intention of moving. His men cheered. They were already seeing longhouses where only grass swayed, already imagining their names in sagas yet to be written, already counting the timber, the fish, the game, already calling this place home. Paradise. That is what they saw. Death dressed as paradise is what they had found. Because the promontory was not empty, it had never been empty, and the people who used it were about to discover what kind of visitors had arrived. As the Vikings rounded the eastern point of the promontory, morning mist clung to the water. Through the gray veil, dark shapes emerged on the beach. 3 overturned hide boats, each large enough to hold several men. The boats lay in a line too regular for accident. Under each boat, shadows suggested hidden forms. Thorvald made a hand signal. Silent as wolves, 30 Norsemen waded through the shallows with weapons drawn. Some of his men counseled caution. These could be traders, fishermen, perhaps women and children. Others saw only obstacles to their new kingdom. Thorvald himself felt the weight of the decision. Leave potential enemies behind to report their position, or remove them now while surprise was on his side. The calculus of invaders throughout history: eliminate the locals, claim the land. Underneath those boats, 8 men slept. They had been gathering food for their families, camping on a beach their ancestors had used for generations. They expected another quiet dawn. They had no idea that death stood over them in iron rings and cold determination. But one of them was not truly asleep. One set of eyes watched through barely open lids as Viking shadows fell across the overturned boats. One hand found a hidden knife. One mind calculated distances, counted enemies, planned escape routes. The morning air hung still. No birds called. Even the waves seemed to quiet, as if the land itself held its breath. Then Thorvald kicked over the first boat. 8 men sprawled on the sand, some genuinely shocked from sleep, others springing to their feet. No weapons visible except hunting knives. No war paint, no defensive formation. Just 8 indigenous men caught between dreams and nightmare. What followed was not conquest, it was murder. The first died before he could stand, a Viking axe splitting his skull with a sound that carried across the still water. The second took a spear through the chest as he reached not for a weapon but for his companion. The third tried to speak, perhaps a greeting, perhaps a plea, before a sword opened his throat. The slaughter took less than 60 seconds. 7 bodies lay on the sand in the gray morning light, blood spreading into the surf, turning the foam pink, then red, then darker. The beach that had been silent moments earlier now smelled of iron and opened bodies. Gulls that had been sleeping on the rocks nearby launched into the air in shrieking clouds, disturbed by the noise and the smell. Vikings who had faced Saxon shield walls and Irish warriors now stood over murdered fishermen, breathing hard from an exertion that had required almost none of the skills they were trained for. Some felt the wrongness immediately. This was not combat. This was butchery. No honor in killing men who never had a chance to fight. Others justified it as necessity, the pragmatic calculus of colonization that would be repeated on this continent for the next 5 centuries, by men who spoke different languages but made the same excuses. But the 8th man, the one who had watched through slitted eyes, was already running. A spear whistled past his ear. A Viking gave chase, but the native moved through the forest like smoke, vanishing into green shadows where no iron-clad pursuer could follow. "Should we track him?" asked Thorvald's second in command. "One man," Thorvald shrugged. "What can one man do?" It was the most catastrophic miscalculation in Viking history. That single question, asked with the casual arrogance of a man who believed iron made him invincible, would be answered within hours. And the answer would cost Thorvald his life and his people their continent. The 8th man ran 5 miles without stopping. He followed paths carved by generations of his people through forest that no Viking could navigate. He burst into a summer gathering camp where over 300 of his people were preparing for seasonal fishing. His words spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. "The pale strangers have returned. They kill without warning, without cause. 7 of our brothers lie dead on the beach at Crossness. Elder councils convened within hours." This was not their first encounter with outsiders who brought violence. But never before had strangers struck so suddenly, so pointlessly. 8 men sleeping under boats, 7 murdered in their blankets. The 8th left alive to carry a message that the strangers themselves did not intend to send. The message was clear. These people will kill you in your sleep. They will do it without provocation, without warning, and without remorse. The response had to match the message. Not rage, something colder, something calculated to ensure that these strangers and any who followed them would understand that this land had defenders who could not be dismissed as obstacles to someone else's dream. Warriors from 6 related bands received the call. By nightfall, boats were launching from hidden coves all along the coast. What followed defied every Viking battle tradition. There were no challenges shouted across water, no champion combat to settle disputes, no negotiation. The indigenous warriors understood something that Thorvald did not. When invaders come to steal your land, you do not fight by their rules, you fight by yours. Back at Crossness, the Vikings established their camp on the very ground where they had committed murder. They drove stakes for a defensive perimeter. They set watches. They cleaned weapons. As darkness fell, Thorvald stood on the headland, where he had declared his future hall would rise. The promontory was everything he had dreamed, but the Skraelings had weapons Thorvald could not see: patience, knowledge, and time. While Vikings watched the obvious approaches, native scouts mapped every sentry position from the forest shadows. Stone points were sharpened with the care of surgeons preparing instruments. Bowstrings were tested and retested. War paint was applied, not for ceremony but for its practical purpose, breaking up human outlines in forest shadow. Hundreds of warriors assembled in their hide boats in the darkness just beyond sight of the Viking sentries. They had spent the hours since sunset approaching in absolute silence, paddles wrapped in sealskin to muffle any sound that might carry across the still water. They moved with the coordination of people who had practiced this kind of approach for generations, who had hunted whales and seals in these same waters, using the same techniques of patience and encirclement they were now applying to a different kind of prey. The formation that emerged from the darkness was precise and practiced. Groups assigned to attack from the water, groups positioned in the forest to the north, groups ready to close the southern approach. The circle was closing around 30 men who still believed their iron made them safe. The stage was set. 30 Vikings behind a wooden palisade versus 10 times their number, burning for justice, intimate with every current and tide. Stone against steel, knowledge against arrogance. Dawn would decide. The sun rose and death came with it. The horizon erupted. What had seemed like empty ocean suddenly birthed a swarm of boats. Dozens of hide-covered kayaks and larger vessels cutting through morning mist in deadly synchronization. No battle cries, just the whisper of 100 paddles striking water together. "Shield wall!" Thorvald's voice cracked like a whip. 30 Vikings locked shields, forming the battle formation that had conquered half of Europe. Round wooden discs overlapping, iron bosses forward, spear points bristling above the rim. This formation had broken Saxon armies. It had weathered Irish ambushes. It had stood firm against Frankish cavalry. It had never faced anything like what came next. The first volley arrived high. Hundreds of arrows arcing through the morning air like a dark rainbow. Vikings raised shields overhead, creating a roof of wood and iron. Arrows thudded into the barrier. Most bounced off. A few found the gaps between shields. One man cursed as a stone point drew blood from his thigh. Another felt a tip scrape across his mail. "Hold!" Thorvald commanded from the ship's stern. The vessel, hauled partially onto shore, served as their command post and final fallback. From its elevated deck, he could see the enemy deploying with a discipline that should have terrified him. The Skraelings were not charging blindly. They maintained distance, staying just beyond the range where Viking axes and swords could reach them. Boats landed north and south, warriors melting into the forest. Others remained on the water, mobile platforms for continuous arrow fire. They were surrounding the Viking position the way a hunter surrounds a wounded animal, with patience and overwhelming numbers. Then came the sound that froze Viking blood. Not steel on steel, but something older. Hundreds of voices raised in rhythmic chanting that rolled across the water and through the forest, and into the bones of every Viking standing behind the shield wall. This was not music. This was the voice of a land, telling its invaders that they were not welcome. The chanting rose and fell in patterns that seemed to synchronize with the arrow volleys, as if the singing and the killing were parts of the same ceremony. Some Vikings gripped their weapons tighter and whispered prayers to Thor and Odin. Others felt something they had never felt before in any battle on any shore. The cold certainty that they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and fighting an enemy who understood this ground the way they understood their own heartbeat. The second assault proved the Skraelings were not the primitives the Norse imagined. Arrows came from 3 directions simultaneously. High, arcing shots from the water, flat trajectories from the forest, harassment fire from constantly moving boats that never stayed in one place long enough to be targeted. With the arrows came sling stones, invisible until they cracked against shield or helmet. The shield wall began to buckle. Not from breaking, but from men instinctively turning to face threats appearing from multiple angles. The formation that depended on every man facing the same direction was being pulled apart by an enemy who attacked from everywhere at once. Thorvald saw the danger. A broken formation meant death. "Forward!" he roared. "Take the battle to them." 20 Vikings charged toward the nearest group of warriors on the beach. Axes raised, battle fury building, the same wild rush that had scattered armies across Europe. But the natives simply melted away. They did not stand and receive the charge the way European enemies did. They ran backward while maintaining devastatingly accurate fire, each archer turning and loosing as he moved, a technique that required a lifetime of practice and a complete absence of the kind of pride that made Viking warriors plant their feet and die rather than give ground. Every step the Vikings took forward brought 3 arrows in response. The ground they gained cost them blood and bought them nothing because the enemy was never where they charged. It was always 20 yards further back, always moving, always shooting. The Viking charge faltered, then reversed. Proud warriors driven backward by enemies who would not stand and fight by rules that Vikings understood. The retreat to the shield wall was its own nightmare. Men backing toward their perimeter while arrows whistled past from angles they could not cover. Several men fell, dragged back by comrades, while stone points continued to find the gaps between iron rings. The Skraelings had no interest in the kind of combat where Viking weapons dominated. They had their own kind of war, and their kind of war was working. Thorvald stood at the ship's stern directing the defense. His mail shirt had turned aside several stone points. His shield bristled with embedded arrows like a porcupine. He was everywhere along the line, shouting encouragement, shifting men to meet threats, showing his warriors that their leader still stood. "Their arrows cannot pierce mail," he called out, showing where stone tips had failed to penetrate his iron rings. "Stand firm. They will run out of shafts." He was wrong about the arrows running out, and he was wrong about the mail, because iron mail has one weakness that no blacksmith can eliminate: joints. Gaps where movement requires flexibility. The places where a man must be able to bend, to reach, to turn his head, to raise his arm. In exactly the time it takes to draw a breath, everything changed. Thorvald spotted a flanking movement to his left. He raised his arm to point, shouting a warning to his men. At that precise moment, an arrow flew true, under the raised arm, through the gap where mail shirt met leather jerkin, between the ribs, into the lung. The archer who fired it had been watching Thorvald for minutes, studying the pattern of his movements, noting that every time the Viking leader pointed to direct his men, his arm rose and the gap beneath it opened. The histories do not record this archer's name. The sagas never asked who he was, but he had been trained since childhood to put a stone point into a moving target at distances that seemed impossible, and he had been patient in a way that Viking warriors, who prized aggressive action above all else, never were, waiting for the gap. And when the gap appeared, he did not hesitate. Thorvald looked down. The shaft protruded from his armpit, wood where wood should not be. He felt something warm running down his side. "I am wounded," he said, almost conversationally, then louder as blood began filling his lung. "I have got a mortal wound under my arm." The shield wall wavered. Their leader, their inspiration, stood swaying with an indigenous arrow in his body. Some men wanted to charge in vengeful fury. Others began backing toward the ship. The Skraelings sensed the breaking point and pressed harder. Thorvald, dying on his feet, continued to command. "Bring me to that headland," he gasped, pointing to the promontory where hours earlier he had planned his haul. "I spoke truth when I said I would dwell there. Bury me with a cross at my head and another at my feet." His last words were not a battle cry. They were not a curse on his enemies or a prayer for vengeance. They were a set of burial instructions. He was telling the land where to find him, telling the people who would dig his grave exactly where to put the crosses and which direction to face the body. Even dying, even defeated, even with the blood of 7 innocent men on his hands and an arrow in his lung, Thorvald Eriksson was planning, building, laying out the dimensions of a home he would occupy forever but never live in. The man who had murdered 8 sleeping strangers for this piece of earth was now asking to be buried in it. The paradox of Thorvald laid bare in his final breath. He loved the land enough to kill for it and die for it. He just did not understand that the land was not his to take, and the people whose blood he had spilled that morning were the ones who would decide whether his bones stayed or were scattered by the tide. The retreat was its own nightmare. Vikings backing toward the water with shields locked, while arrows continued to fall from all sides. They dragged their wounded and carried their dying leader, his blood leaving a trail across the sand that the rising tide would wash away within hours. Several men fell in the surf, pulled down by the weight of mail in water or pierced by final volleys. The ocean that had carried them here was now one more enemy trying to drown them, but somehow most made it aboard. As they pushed off, arrows thudded into the hull. One last volley fell short as Viking oars bit deep and the ship gained open water. Behind them, Crossness remained in indigenous hands. The promontory Thorvald had claimed with words remained claimed by the people who had lived there for 12,000 years. The burial party worked through the night. 20 exhausted Vikings dug into American soil, while 10 stood guard. They buried Thorvald where he had commanded, on the headland overlooking the harbor he would never settle. Crosses carved from American oak, the same timber Thorvald had planned to use for the great hall he would never build, stood at his head and feet. Between them lay the first European to die in battle for American soil. A man who had sailed 3,000 miles to find paradise, and found it and lost it in the same afternoon. The crosses presented a paradox of their own. These Vikings were nominally Christian, Greenland having converted only years before, but their faith mixed uneasily with older beliefs. They spoke the Lord's Prayer over the grave, then added older words, asking the Valkyries to welcome a warrior and requesting safe passage to whatever hall awaited him on the other side. The first European grave in North America marked not the beginning of colonization, but its delay. The survivors sailed for Greenland, carrying wounds and a story that would echo through the sagas. Of the original 30, 23 made it home alive. They brought back no timber, no resources, no hope. Only the knowledge that Vinland was defended by people who could not be brushed aside with iron and contempt. Years later, Thorfinn Karlsefni would try again with 160 colonists, women, children, cattle, tools for farming rather than raiding. For one brief moment, it seemed the Norse might succeed through peace, where war had failed. A child named Snorri drew his first breath in the New World, the first European born in America. But tensions erupted again. During one desperate skirmish when the men were retreating in panic, A pregnant Viking woman named Freydis, Eric's own daughter, 8 months heavy with child, grabbed a sword from a dead man's hand. Surrounded by advancing warriors who had driven armed Viking men backward, she did something that no saga had ever recorded and no historian has ever fully explained. She bared one breast and slapped the flat of the blade against it, screaming in fury at the warriors closing around her. The Skraelings stopped. They stared, and then they fled. A pregnant woman, armed with nothing but madness and a borrowed sword, had done what 30 armed warriors could not. She had made the enemy hesitate, but it was a hollow victory. If survival required pregnant women fighting with swords, permanent settlement was impossible. They abandoned Vinland within 3 years. No Norse expedition ever returned. Greenland itself would fail by 1450, its last inhabitants starving when climate change made even subsistence farming impossible. The timber that could have saved them remained in Vinland's forests, protected by stone arrows and Viking fear. 500 years would pass before Europeans successfully established permanent settlements in the Americas. And when they came, it was not iron that conquered the continent. It was disease. Smallpox and measles did what Viking axes could not. The people who had stopped Thorvald with a single arrow had no defense against an enemy they could not see or fight or reason with. But that is a different story for a different century. This story ends on a beach in the year 1004, where 7 murdered men lie in the surf, and an 8th runs through the forest, carrying the news that will bring an army. Where 30 Vikings who conquered half of Europe discover that iron is not enough when the enemy knows the ground and will not stand still to be killed. Where one arrow finds one gap in one suit of armor and changes the next 500 years of human history. 30 Vikings sailed to claim a continent. One arrow sent them home. The man who fired it did not know he was changing history. The man who died from it did not know he was the last Viking who would ever fight for American soil. And the continent that swallowed them both is still here, still remembering the morning when stone met steel and steel lost.